Is everyone always selfish? Psychological egoism is the position that every human motivation is selfish in the sense that every motivation has the ultimate goal of benefiting oneself. For example, the psychological egoist believes that the person who gives to charity has a selfish motivation because these donations lead to a tax write-off, a reward in the afterlife, a sense of superiority, a pleasure, or simply the self-satisfaction of giving. In short, the psychological egoist believes you are always selfish. Every human motivation has the ultimate aim of benefiting oneself. The non-egoist disagrees and believes that unselfish, altruistic motivations are possible. So the next question is, why is this issue important? Now, psychological egoism is a hypothesis about human nature, so it affects many of your other beliefs, emotions, and desires. That's why it's a fundamental or philosophical issue. For example, if psychological egoism is true, if it's true that every human motivation is selfish, then I shouldn't tell my child to sometimes be unselfish, since that would be impossible if psychological egoism is true. And the Catholic Church should not tell people to want the good of the other as other, since, according to psychological egoism, it's only possible to want another's good if doing so benefits oneself. Finally, be aware that if you marry a psychological egoist, he or she will interpret all of your motives as selfish or self-interested. So, in short, psychological egoism is important for many reasons. And the most important reason seems to be that it would undermine the common sense moral belief that unselfish or altruistic motives are possible. Okay, in this third section, let's look at the form or pattern of debate. Now, the most common pattern of debate about psychological egoism begins when the psychological egoist asserts that all motives or actions are selfish. By the way, Thanksgiving is near. If you want to frustrate your family, play the role of psychological egoist over the dinner table. You could start by telling your mom that she's totally selfish for cooking this meal. And let me know how that goes. Now, after the egoist makes this assertion, the non-egoist will give examples of apparently altruistic acts, like giving to charity or jumping on a grenade to save others. The psychological egoist then lists possible selfish motives, like giving to charity for the tax break, or jumping on the grenade for a reward in the afterlife, or to be remembered as a hero, or to avoid living with the pain of a guilty conscience. The psychological egoist may also argue that every motivation must be selfish because, each person's seeking satisfaction of their desires, and this is selfish since they are trying to satisfy their own desires. In short, most debates about psychological egoism involve the non-egoist giving examples of apparently unselfish or altruistic acts, and then the egoist listing possible selfish motives for those acts. Okay, let's turn to the fourth section where we look at distinctions and criticisms against psychological egoism, where it'll become apparent why I think psychological egoism is false. Okay, so the first distinction. Notice that listing possible selfish motives doesn't prove those motives are true. For example, the hero could have jumped on the grenade for selfish motives, like a reward in the afterlife, or for the more altruistic motive of saving the 5 children, even though he knows he himself will die. Listing possible motives, selfish or altruistic, doesn't prove them true. It's simply speculation over the dinner table. So the psychological egoist needs to prove much more, not just list possible motives. A second issue that often arises in these debates is some psychological egoists confuse motive with consequence. So consider this airplane example. I may fly on a plane to get to LA, and the effect or the consequence is the plane burns gas. But it doesn't follow my motive was to burn gas. One would be confusing consequence with motive if he argued I got on the plane to burn gas. In a similar way, the psychological egoist argument that Jane got pleasure after giving to charity, so she selfishly did it to merely get that pleasure, is based on a confusion between motive and consequence. So by the way, in the Friends episode, Joey makes this mistake because he argued she felt pleasure after helping her brother, so she did it merely for the pleasure. In short, the psychological egoist needs to prove that pleasure is the motive, but this argument has only shown it is an effect or consequence of the act. A third issue that will certainly arise in psychological egoism debates is the problem of how to define selfish. So in my experience, most psychological egoists shift the meaning of selfish, or they inflate the meaning of selfish during the discussions. This may be the most important issue to clarify when debating psychological egoism. Okay, so psychological egoism is not the position that every desire comes from you. It's the position that every motive or desire aims to ultimately benefit you. The fact that every desire or motivation may come from you is trivial and tells us nothing about the object or aim of the motivation. As Rachel says, it's not that I desire that makes the desire selfish. It's what I desire that makes it selfish or altruistic. Now, here's another important distinction. Some psychological egoists argue that since the saint is satisfying his desire to help others and the serial killer is satisfying his desire to harm others, they are both selfish because they're seeking, both of them, the satisfaction of their desires. But again, this confuses satisfying one's desires with the object leading to satisfaction. When most people use the word unselfish, they mean the saint is unselfish and the serial killer is selfish, precisely because they are talking about the aim of the desire itself, not the fact that the saint and the serial killer may, and I say may, both be seeking satisfaction. Of course, are they just seeking satisfaction? Is that the same as pleasure? No. Okay, that's important to think about. Anyway, notice too that psychological egoism is not a hypothesis about the unconscious or subconscious. Psychological egoism only states that if a person has an intention, then the intention is ultimately to benefit oneself. Okay? So I could go on and on about the many semantic confusions that arise in debates about psychological egoism. The main point is that psychological egoism often seems plausible at first, but that's because the meaning of selfish is inflated or shifts. So to clarify the meaning, I recommend using the definition Daniel Batson used in his research while trying to test psychological egoism. Psychological egoism is the position that the ultimate aim of every human motivation is to benefit the self. The ultimate aim of every human motivation is always one's own welfare. The non-egoist disagrees and believes that at least some human motivations aim to ultimately benefit the other, even if satisfying that desire offers no benefit to oneself. So in short, some forms of psychological egoism seem plausible because they are equivocating or using inflated meanings of selfish and unselfish. To avoid merely verbal debates, use the most testable definition of psychological egoism, of egoism and altruism, and that's Batson's, Daniel Batson's. All right. Another issue to keep in mind while debating psychological egoism is how difficult it is to know other people's deepest motivations. And yet the psychological egoist is claiming to know them when they say every human motivation is selfish. Why are they so sure they know everyone's motivations? How can they empirically measure the motives of others? After all, we can see actions, but not motives. Now, while it may be irrelevant, the topic of subconscious motives frequently arises in conversations about psychological egoism. But notice how difficult it is, especially to know all of one's subconscious motives, as well as their conscious motives. I have problems knowing my own deepest motives, especially after reading Freud or Jung. So in short, the point is, motives are difficult to discern, but the psychological egoist is making a strong claim about all motives. We should be careful when speculating about these motives that we cannot really measure. All right, let's go to the Daniel Batson research now. This is the fifth point. Now, I mentioned that it's difficult to know motives since we cannot really see them, but Daniel Batson is a social psychologist who has created clever ways to try to test psychological egoism. Interestingly, Batson was a psychological egoist before the experiments, but rejected it after them because they suggested that at least some human motives have the ultimate aim of benefiting the other, not oneself. That is, people sometimes seek to benefit the other even when there's no benefit to oneself. Altruism exists. Now, you can check out his research, but the bottom line is that when we use somewhat testable definitions of egoism, selfish, or altruism, unselfish, the research does not prove psychological egoism true. Indeed, Daniel Batson's research suggests that psychological egoism is false. Okay, the sixth one. Most forms of psychological egoism have the problem of being untestable or unfalsifiable in principle. So I just mentioned Batson's research, but again, most psychological egoists are not like Daniel Batson because they're using untestable and unfalsifiable versions of psychological egoism. So to understand testability and falsifiability, consider this testable hypothesis. tomato plants need water to grow. Now I can imagine what would make this hypothesis false. Observing a tomato plant growing without water. So this hypothesis is testable or falsifiable in principle, because I can imagine what would make it false, even though in reality we see the hypothesis confirmed. The point is, we know what would make it false if it were false, and so that's why we can test it. This is the foundation of scientific experiments. But with many versions of psychological egoism, the egoist cannot even imagine what would make their theory false. So I've argued with psychological egoists who say there's no way around it. Psychological egoism must be true. For every situation, they list some possible selfish motive while equivocating or inflating the meaning of selfish. So he did it for a reward in the afterlife. He did it for pleasure. It's from him, so it's selfish. Or he's seeking his own satisfaction, so it's selfish. But if the psychological egoist cannot even imagine what would make psychological egoism false, if it were false, then the hypothesis of psychological egoism is not falsifiable, it's not testable. And this is usually a weakness, not a strength, because it means that psychological egoism is not a scientific hypothesis, but more like an ideology, a matter of faith. Psychological egoism sounds scientific to some people, but most versions of it, excluding Batson's, are not at all testable, not at all falsifiable in principle, and so they are not scientific. So in short, one problem with most forms of psychological egoism is nothing imaginable would make them false, if they were false, and so they are not testable or falsifiable in principle. Psychological egoism is not a scientific theory, but more like an ideology or lens through which people view the world. A seventh problem that arises in these debates is the false dilemma fallacy. So the psychological egoist assumes that each motive must be entirely selfish or entirely unselfish. But some philosophers believe there are two reasons this is a mistaken assumption. First, when I help an old lady across the street, my motivations might include the nickel she gives me, self-interest, the personal pleasure I derive from it, which could be self-interest, and a genuine desire for her well-being, which could be altruistic. Since the human psyche is complex, I can simultaneously have both selfish and altruistic motives for helping her across the street. So we can have mixed motives. But there's a deeper point here made by Lawrence Hinman. If you draw a graph and you label the x-axis egoism and the y-axis altruism, notice there are 4 quadrants. When talking about the hero and the grenade, we can see that any action can be described as a blend of egoism and altruism. For example, jumping on the grenade is high on altruism and low on egoism. Throwing the grenade away is high on egoism and altruism, and so on. So this graph shows that any one action can be both a mix of altruism and egoism. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And the same is true with motives. So in short, it seems to be a false dilemma fallacy, or oversimplification, to believe that each motive must be entirely selfish or entirely altruistic. Each motive can be a blend, a complex blend of both altruism and egoism. Okay, the 8th criticism is about biology and evolution. Some people misinterpret books like Dawkins's Selfish Gene to mean that biology and evolution support psychological egoism, but this is false. Dawkins meant that as a metaphor. Now, first, genes don't have motives, and so they're irrelevant to psychological egoism, which is about human motives. Second, notice that the meaning of altruism in biology can be different from the meaning of altruism in psychology. It depends on the context. So evolutionary altruism is behavior that reduces one's reproductive fitness, while psychological altruism is the motivation with the ultimate goal of increasing another's welfare. Psychological egoism is about motives, not behavior. So we want to be careful there when we infer something from biology and evolution. But if biology and evolution support anything, they support the claim that psychological egoism is false. Biologists are constantly describing altruism in animals and how natural selection would select for altruistic motivations, not simply selfish or egoistic ones. There's some debate here, and you'll find biologists distinguishing between kin, group, and reciprocal altruism, but most believe that the process of natural selection could and does produce people with truly altruistic motivations, at least some of the time. Now, there's much more to say, but the bottom line is biology does not really support psychological egoism. On the contrary, most of the evidence there suggests that psychological egoism is false. Now, for more depth on evolution and biology, see minute 42 of my longer video on psychological egoism. All right, the 9th criticism is about religion and the idea of no self. So the idea here is that most religious traditions have strands that reject psychological egoism. Buddhists teach the doctrine of no self, and many religions speak of the death of self or the loss of self, this type of selfless, altruistic love, ecstasy, going out of oneself, transcending the self, mystical experience. So the problem is simple. Most religions teach that the most meaningful experiences in life involve the loss of self instead of a pursuit of self-interest. And so if psychological egoism is true, these experiences are impossible. Most religions, therefore, assume psychological egoism is false, and they have practices that cultivate altruistic motivations. And in short, people who have had religious or mystical experiences usually believe that they have direct evidence that psychological egoism is false. All right, the 10th criticism, free will and determinism. Notice the psychological egoism debate is not about free will and determinism, though that sometimes comes up in these debates. For we could imagine making two robots with no free will, right? Robots that are determined. And one of these robots is selfish all the time, and one's altruistic all the time. So once you really let that sink in, you can see that this debate has nothing to do with free will and determinism. It's about whether all human motivations are selfish or not. And finally, notice this debate about psychological egoism is not a debate about whether it's good or bad to be selfish. It's just a debate about whether human nature can only have motivations that are selfish in the end. Okay, let's conclude. So my conclusion is psychological egoism initially seems plausible, but upon rigorous examination, it simply seems false. The psychological egoist has a set of arguments that equivocates in the meaning of selfish, confuses motive with consequence, lists possible motives without proving them true, commits the false dilemma fallacy, confuses the psychological debate with debates about free will and determinism. They misinterpret evolutionary theory and draw weak inferences from it. And they present untestable and unfalsifiable forms of egoism, psychological egoism. So when researchers like Daniel Batson define terms more precisely, the test actually gives strong evidence that psychological egoism is probably false. And the nature of religious and mystical experience also offers introspective evidence against psychological egoism. So my position is humans are capable of truly unselfish, altruistic actions and motives. And so common sense morality and religion are not describing the impossible. And those who try to accept, by the way, psychological egoism and build a morality on that, I think they're deluding themselves, but that's a different topic. Okay, thanks for listening. Recording made in November 2024.